Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about the discovery and exploration of the New World. So, the first thing that we need to understand is how history is studied, because we need to have a conception of that before we can actually go in and study it, right? So, history is defined by something called continuity. Continuity is change happening over time and as a continuation of a cycle rather than progression. A lot of the time, we have a tendency to think of history as something that happens on a timeline, which is probably a little bit our fault when we show you timelines. Timelines are really useful in understanding when things happened in comparison to other events, but that's not really how history actually happens. Everything is really interconnected. It's like a web rather than a line. And so the concept of continuity allows us to examine events in context and have a better understanding of them rather than just looking at them as if they are a linear progression that's trying to get us to some ultimate goal like today. So now that we understand a little bit about how history is studied, and we're going to go back to that concept later on, we're going to go ahead and start to talk about the first Americans. So this is American history, and really, we're going to start talking about colonization and discovery and how we make America into the United States. But first, we need to talk a little bit about the people who were here before us. And so the first Americans are believed to have been nomadic hunters who migrated to the Americas. Now, there are a lot of different theories about how that happened. And there are a lot of different groups of people that we think came over. So, one thing for you to remember is usually there's not a simple, clear-cut answer in history. Most likely, all of these different theories that we have, there were probably a combination of all of them happening. But these are our best guesses. So, the first thing that I want to point out, the first theory, is something called the land bridge hypothesis. So, you can see the land bridge hypothesis right here. Um, But this picture here also illustrates it. So this picture is a little bit better of an illustration because it's kind of closer in. The land bridge hypothesis has this idea that at one point the land all throughout the world was kind of closer together, and a lot of it was above water that's below water now. One of those places that we can definitely tell that that happened is a place called the Bering Strait. The Bering Strait is in between Siberia, which is over there where Russia and all that jazz is, and Alaska. So the Bering Strait is water now. That's what a strait is. But it used to be above land, right? It used to be above the water. And so we have figured that out because we've found things, archaeologists have found remnants. They've found things from people living that are on the bottom of the sea now, but were once above the water. So, what we think with the land bridge hypothesis is exactly what it sounds like. We think that there used to be a land bridge called the Bering Land Bridge that connected Siberia and Alaska. Now, we know for a fact that at one point this land bridge existed. And what we think happened is as the ice caps melted a little bit, as we got a little bit out of the ice age, um, animals were moving to warmer climates. And of course, people were following the animals because that was their source of food. So we think that people literally just kind of walked to the Americas. Now, there are other hypotheses, other ideas about how people could have gotten here. And like I said, most likely it's a combination of all of these. Nobody got together, a big group of people, and said, hey, we're going to America today. Let's all use the land bridge. Most likely you had people from different places all throughout the world getting here at different times in different ways. So, a couple of the big theories, there's a Solutrean hypothesis, which is basically the idea that people came to North America via boats from Europe. The coastal migration hypothesis is very similar, the idea that people came from Asian countries. And the coastal migration hypothesis is interesting because while Europe and America would have been a lot closer, making it possible for these boats to make it all the way to America, Asia still would have been a little bit farther away. But we have this idea that there would have been some islands. These are very detailed, very accurately depicted islands right there. So it would have been islands, and essentially Asians would have just hopped from one island to another until they kind of got around here. And so those are our three big hypotheses for North America. Now, we do also believe that there's a possibility that Africans came over to South America, and then just kind of like worked their way upward. And there's some evidence to support all of these ideas. But ultimately, we don't really know exactly which one happened, or if all of them did. All right, so to understand what happened after people got to the Americas, we're going to look first at some Paleo-Indian cultures in North America. Now, in a couple minutes, we're actually going to go down to South America where we're going to see the development of some civilizations. Cultures and civilizations are a little bit different as far as how we define them. Civilizations, some of the big things that they need are hierarchical governments and organized cities, and especially a system of writing. None of the cultures, none of the Native American groups in North America are going to have that system of writing. And so we're not going to consider any of those guys civilizations. For now, though, we're going to talk about the Clovis, the Folsom, and the Plano. All of these guys existed in North America long time ago. They existed in a time period that we refer to as BCE. Right now, we live in CE. We're in the year 2020 when I'm recording this, at least. We're in the year 2020, and that year is CE, the Common Era. And we've been counting from 1 to 2020. BCE is before 1. It means before the Common Era. And when you get into BCE, you count backwards with the years. So it can get a little bit confusing. We're not going to concern ourselves with that. All of these guys existed in North America and they existed in kind of overlapping time periods. But what you're going to see is a great illustration of continuity, because they exist in overlapping time periods, so they have contact with each other, but you're going to see them grow and change over time. So, first we have the Clovis. Now, the Clovis were well known for killing big game with spearheads. All right, so they had spearheads like this. They look kind of like arrowheads. If you live in Georgia, you've probably seen an arrowhead, but they're a lot bigger. And they're put on the end of a spear. You throw the spear. That's how you take down big game. Now, when I say big game, I don't mean they're taking down deer or even buffalo. They're taking down, at this point in time, things like woolly mammoths. You guys know Manny from Ice Age? They're killing Manny from Ice Age. Manny from Ice Age is huge, you guys. He's huge and he has really, really thick skin and he's very difficult to take down. And so, what we learn from studying the Clovis and their spearheads is they've developed weapons and work together in a way that helps them be able to bring down these animals. That shows us that they're starting to kind of form little culture groups that stick together. So then we've got the Folsom. The Folsom are going to have some experience with the Clovis. There's going to be some interaction, but they're going to exist a little bit longer. they're also going to use spearheads. That's the idea of continuity. You have change over time, but a lot of the time, the next group is going to use what the first guys did. They're just going to improve on it. And that's what the Folsom do. They use these distinct fluted spearheads. So, what that means is if you look at this top illustration, you've got these little grooves right here. So, these little grooves, all of this in here is kind of carved inward. It goes down. And the intention of that is for when the spearhead sticks into the animal, it'll actually catch on the bone. It gives them a better chance of taking the animal down. So it's making getting food easier. It's going to take less people and it'll be more efficient. So the Folsom are improving on what the Clovis are doing. Then you've got the Plano. The Plano are also going to use spearheads, but they're going to do it slightly differently. They're going to use spearheads and they're going to use arrowheads. So I mentioned arrowheads a second ago. Arrowheads are a lot smaller than spearheads. I don't know if you guys have noticed this, but as we become more and more technologically advanced, what has a tendency to happen is first you'll have something really big. Like if you look at the Clovis right here, their spearheads are pretty big. Then things get smaller. So it's a little bit smaller with the Folsom, right? Then as technology advances, things get a little bit bigger again. That's what happens with the Plano. But then the technology will be improved upon and it'll get kind of tiny. So you can think of it as cell phones. So a lot of you guys probably aren't as old as I am, but my first cell phone, you guys, was huge. If you've ever seen like the Nokia memes, the big like brick phone that is undestroyable, that was my very first cell phone. It's huge. And as cell phones became more popular, they got really, really small for a while. One of my phones that I had, it was called a Motorola Razr, and it was super, super thin, but it was still, you started to see the development of flip phones. It's super thin, it's super small. Um, so the Nokia is kind of like the Clovis. The Razor is like the Folsom. It's a little bit more user friendly. You've got the flip phones, so you're not accidentally dialing. It's easier to text on a Razor. It's still terrible. There was something called T9. You had to push the button so many times to get a letter, but it gets smaller. So the Razor is kind of like the Folsom. Then, as technology got better, we started seeing cell phones with touch screens, and so our screens started to get bigger and bigger. So like the Galaxy phones or the Notes. I used to have a Galaxy Note. It was huge. And so that's what you see kind of with the Plano. The spearhead gets a little bit bigger again, but as they do that, they also they'll develop arrowheads. And those arrowheads are a lot tinier. And instead of having to throw them like a spearhead, you put them on an arrow and then a bow launches that arrow. It means that you can kill things from farther away. It means that it's more accurate. You have the bow kind of guiding you. um, I can shoot a bow and arrow. And I mean, I guess I could throw a spear, but like probably not very far. So it's a lot easier to hunt once you have those arrowheads. Um, they're also going to use their arrowheads to hunt animals, but also to kill humans. So now these guys are even more settled than the Folsom and the Clovis. So much so that they're starting to have loyalties to their group, and there's starting to be more and more people, and so there's going to be fighting amongst them. So that was the Paleo Indian cultures. Those guys were in North America. And so we're going to jump on down to South America and Middle America, the Latin America kind of area that connects the two. And we're going to talk about Mesoamerican civilizations. I want to tell you guys about these because I want you to understand that Native America, the New World, as we tend to think of it, it wasn't just a bunch of Native Americans running around in teepees. These guys had advanced civilizations, and you see it the most with the Mesoamerican civilizations in South America. But again, these guys are going to be really good illustrations of the concept of continuity. Um, so first, we're going to talk about the Olmec. So the Olmec were the earliest American civilization that we know of. Now, there was quite possibly something hidden in a rainforest that we have no idea about. There are places that we haven't explored. But as far as we know, the Olmecs are the oldest American civilization. Now, remember, that's different than the oldest group of people that lived there, because not every culture and not every group becomes a civilization. Now, the Olmec had a few things that made them into a civilization. They had powerful priests and aristocrats. So they have that hierarchy. Remember, I told you guys you need a hierarchy. They're also going to have ceremonial centers. Now, you don't have to have religion in order to be a civilization, but a lot of the time you're going to see religion start to become important once you start to become a civilization or a very settled culture. When you have just a hunter-gatherer sort of group, usually they don't care that much about religion because they're mostly just thinking about how they're going to get their next meal. They also have a written calendar. All right, written is really important. That means that they have a written language, and that is one of the hallmarks of a civilization. Another big thing that you see with a lot of civilizations is a big way of having communication or um, a way to kind of disseminate information. And so the Olmecs are going to have a large trade network to do that. They also have some really interesting statues, so I wanted to kind of point those out to you guys. The picture on the right, these are Olmec statues, and they still exist today. If you have ever seen Legends of the Hidden Temple, this guy over here, his name is Olmec, and he's a big feature on Legends of the Hidden Temple. And he's actually modeled after these Olmec statues, and they did a pretty good job. He looks pretty much like these guys, except it looks like he has some kind of good contour going on right here. So I made him into Rudolph, but you get what I mean. So those are the Olmec. Now, after the Olmec, what we're going to see is a lot of these ideas that they have are going to disseminate through the trade networks and they'll be passed on to other groups and they're going to influence other civilizations. That's what we mean when we talk about continuity and change over time. So next I want to talk about the Mayans. Now you guys have probably heard of the Mayans at some point. We thought that the world was going to end because of these dudes, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But the Mayans were a pretty large civilization that were known for having these huge pyramid temples. So pyramids like these guys. They also had a hieroglyphic writing system. So both of these things are very reminiscent of ancient Egypt, and some other places, but typically we kind of think of Egypt when we think of pyramids and hieroglyphs. And so something that you're going to see is a lot of these early civilizations have very similar things like pyramids and hieroglyphs. Um, Even though they've never had any sort of contact with each other. One of the reasons for that is because, as far as pyramids, this is a really easy structure to build by hand and have everything not come toppling down. It's a way to build something as big as like a skyscraper without it falling. And hieroglyphs are kind of the predecessor to having a written alphabet. Hieroglyphs are essentially pictures, and so they're a lot easier to develop. So usually those kind of develop first. The Mayans also had some pretty complex irrigation systems. We have a tendency to think that indoor plumbing is a newer sort of thing. We think of it as modern history that we developed it. But that's not really the case. We kind of lose the idea of plumbing after ancient Greek and Roman times. There's this period called the Dark Ages that we'll actually talk about in a few minutes. And after that period, everything it kind of gets forgotten, but irrigation and plumbing existed in a lot of early civilizations. These guys, it was especially important for them because they lived in a very deserty sort of area. So they had to get water to their crops because they were living in one place and they weren't really going out and hunting and gathering. They were growing things. They also had a really accurate calendar and number system. That's where we thought the world was going to end, you guys. We thought that the world was going to end because the Mayan calendar ended. Everybody lost their minds. What really probably happened, though, is not that the Mayans were predicting the end of the world with ending their calendars, but they abandoned their cities around the year 900 CE. And we don't really know exactly what happened. It could have been a large drought, there could have been some sort of war or famine, could have been aliens, who really knows? But they abandoned their cities, and when they do, most likely that's when their calendars stop being written. They were just very efficient and were already into the 2000s by the time their civilization fell apart. Another interesting thing about the Mayans, though, is a theory that I have come across in the last few years, and there aren't a whole lot of historians who are into it. There hasn't been a whole lot of research done, but the Mayans may have actually broken up, and some of them may have come to Georgia. Um, One thing that kind of gives us the idea that that could have happened is the presence of Chihuahuas in Georgia. Chihuahuas were actually worshipped by the Mayans, and they would grow them until they were big and fat, and then they would eat them. And so they had these little statues of big fat Chihuahuas, and we found some that are very similar in ruins in Georgia, and Chihuahuas aren't native to North America. We've also found some carvings that indicate that maybe some of the Mayans ended up here. In addition to all that, I also wanted to talk a little bit about religion because religion is a really, really great way to help you understand continuity, because religion grows and changes over time. So in Mayan society, there was the idea of the absolute power of kings. Kings were kind of just considered to be, if not gods themselves, able to speak to the gods. They also practice a lot of human sacrifice. One of the specific things that they like to do is something called bloodletting. So when you sacrifice somebody, you don't just like throw them into a pit or something like that. You would usually slit their throats, you would collect the blood, and that blood and the person would be offered up to the gods. One of the things that they did that I think is just super interesting is they had a ball game that they would use to determine who was the human sacrifice. So in this game, you had to use your elbows, your knees, and your hips to get a ball through a hoop. But imagine playing this game and it's like the worst day in PE ever. Like you're playing dodgeball and you're the first one to get out, so that means that you die. So that's kind of what was going on in Mayan society. And they thought that their gods, their pantheon of gods, were responsible for things like the weather and whether or not agriculture took, so whether or not there was a good harvest. One of their gods, his name was Kukulkan. So Kukulkan is illustrated in all of these pictures up here. You can see him in a bunch of different ways, but this one is kind of my favorite. We're going to see this sort of picture later on. So Kukulkan was a very kind of angry god. One of the things that he really liked was human sacrifice, and so people would sacrifice other human beings to Kukulkan to ensure the continued success of the Mayans. We're going to see him pop up later. And that's that idea of continuity. He pops up later, same dude, just with a different name. So keep an eye out for him. You don't have to keep an eye out for all that long because he's right here. So this guy, his name is Quetzalcoatl. Quetzalcoatl is essentially Kukulkan, but with a different name. He has the same basic ideas. Kukulkan and Quetzalcoatl are both known as the sovereign plumed serpent. So he's kind of a snake. This is my snake. He's a very happy snake. So there's the snake. He's a snake, but he has feathers. So he looks kind of like a chicken. So I like to call him the chicken basilisk. Took longer for me to spell than I thought it would. If you guys are Harry Potter fans, I'm a big Harry Potter fan. The basilisk in Chamber of Secrets, this guy looks a lot like him. So he first makes his appearance in the Toltec people. The Toltec people were really warlike, and they worship Quetzalcoatl. Now, the idea that they were super warlike, is really important because before we saw trade, right? We saw, especially with my pin stopped working. That's close enough to trade. We saw trade, um, and that was how ideas were disseminated, but you can also use war. You can be nice or you can be mean. Doesn't really matter, but either way, the ideas are getting there. And those ideas, the idea of being very warlike, is actually going to transfer over to the Aztec, who we're going to talk about in just a second. All right, so the Aztec. These are guys that a lot of people have heard of. The Aztec conquered most of Mexico. They are really, really interesting. Their capital city is Tenochtitlan. This is Tenochtitlan. It is in the middle of an island. The reason that it was placed where it was is supposedly because someone saw um, a hawk with a snake in its mouth on a prickly pear cactus, and that was some sort of foreshadowing, and that's why they decided that Tenochtitlan had to exist where it did. So they build this huge capital city with a bunch of canals. Um, the Aztec are also really well known for having a system of writing that had widespread literacy. They were so literate that they had people writing down their history, which is interesting for historians like me, but it's also interesting because if you have enough free time to have somebody's job be sitting there thinking about history and writing it down, you have a pretty settled society. Um, it's also really interesting that they have such widespread literacy because at the same time that the Aztec exist, we're going to see the Dark Ages and the Renaissance happening in Europe. And usually we think of Europe as kind of the pinnacle of where culture and civilization were. And at the time that you had a lot of people not able to read, not able to speak the language that the Bible was written in, you have the Aztec and most of them being able to read. So, something that's kind of fundamental to us now, the Aztec could do it, and a lot of Europeans couldn't. These guys, though, also are going to heavily practice human sacrifice. Um, so, once again, you're going to see lots of bloodletting. One of the big things with the human sacrifice amongst the Aztec, though, is most of the time they're going to use war captives because remember, they're conquering Mexico. So they're going around to other different groups. Knock, knock, who's there? It's the Aztec. You guys are going to be Aztec now, too. Also, we're going to sacrifice a bunch of you guys to, you guessed it, Quetzalcoatl. This is Quetzalcoatl right here. He looks a lot like that first illustration of Kukulkan that we saw with the Mayans, right? So you've got the war captives being sacrificed when there was a time where there wasn't any war, which was fairly few and far between. But if you had years where no war was happening, they would actually have ritual warfare, kind of like war games or like capture the flag, or even paintball that we would play today. They would kind of play at war, and the guys who lost, they played war, but they got real life dead, you guys. All right, so the last civilization that I want to talk about is the Incans. Now, the Aztec and the Incans both existed around the same time. They also both existed until contact with Europe. The Spanish are actually going to come over first, and the Spanish are going to be responsible for toppling both the Aztec and Incan empires. The Incans were possibly the largest empire in the 16th century. They had this really cool system of roads going on. Now, the roads were only allowed to be used by certain officials, but they had some roads. They also had this early system of it's kind of socialism, kind of communism, kind of not either. But basically, the government was in charge of everything, and the common people paid a labor tax. So basically, they had to work within the Incan Empire. If you worked, then you were part of the empire and you got part of the spoils of the empire. They made sure that you were fed and clothed and generally taken care of. One of the interesting things about this is because of this system of socialism, communism, whatever you want to call it, because of this system, crime was actually almost non existent. Now, people will always find a reason to fight with each other, you guys. And so later on, this isn't going to be the case. We're still going to fight with each other, even though there's not really any crime. But it is really interesting that in the Incan Empire, where everything was kind of commonly owned, since everybody is taken care of and everybody kind of has an equal footing, except for the people in charge, nobody really has a reason to steal anything from anybody else. There's nothing that they really want or need. They also used a written system called the Keepa. So this, instead of it being written on paper, we have a system of colored and knotted cords. So it's still considered a writing system. We actually cannot translate this. We don't know what any of it says. We're pretty sure that it was used to keep records and things like that, but we honestly don't know what it says. All right, so let's move back up to North America, you guys. So here's the thing. There are tons and tons and tons of Native American tribes in North America. You can see from this map, there's a whole bunch of them, and these are only representative of major tribes. So there are lots more than the faces that you see here. You can also see all of these faces, they look a lot different. Some of them look a little bit different than the picture that we have in our mind of what a Native American is. Generally, we think of Native Americans as having the kind of brown skin. They have really long hair. Sometimes it's like in little like pigtail braids. They have feathers in their hair. They live in teepees. They hunt the buffalo. That's actually only kind of these guys. These guys are the Great Plains Native Americans. And they're kind of the idea that we typically have in our head of what an Indian is. But you've got all sorts of different groups that have differing ideologies, differing ways of life, but they do all have, or at least most, have some things in common. These guys were, for the most part, semi-sedentary. What that means is that they did hunt and gather, but they also had fairly permanent settlements. A lot of the time, what you would see is you would have Native American groups that had kind of a settlement northward to where it was a little bit cooler in the summer, and then in the winter they would go south, and it would be a little bit warmer there, and they would kind of go between these settlements and hunt in between them, and they'd grow things in both places. They'd just kind of jump back and forth. Um, so they have kind of small nomadic settlements. They also grow what's called the Three Sisters. This is maize, which is corn, squash, and beans. Most Native American groups subsisted for the most part on these, with the addition of meat and things like that that were hunted. They're also matrilineal. This is a big problem that the Americans, well, the Europeans who become Americans are going to have with native groups. Europeans and the United States, they're patrilineal. If you've ever heard anything about the patriarchy, man, the patriarchy is led by males, by the father. So, patriarchy actually comes from the Latin root word pater, which means father. Um, Matrilineal or matriarchy comes from mater or mother. So matrilineal means that everything is passed down through the woman. This is something that is completely foreign to the colonizers who are coming over and meeting these native groups. And they think that it makes the Native Americans weak. They think that it makes them stupid, and they just simply don't understand it. Also, Native Americans generally don't have an understanding of land ownership in the same way that we do today. Native groups thought that their land was owned by them collectively. There was no actual like title to the land or anything. They essentially thought that the gods gave it to them. We're going to see that in a minute with the Cherokee creation myth. Um, so they they thought that the land was theirs, but that it should also be shared. And so when colonizers come in and they start settling on native land, Native Americans kind of assume that they're going to have a little small settlement, they'll move on, they'll kind of go back and forth, and they'll do what Native American groups do. And that's just really not what happens. So I wanted to give you guys some examples of Native American groups that aren't really what we think of. So the Southwest Native Americans lived in places like this, like Mesa Verde. Mesa Verde is quite literally carved into the side of some mountain. So very much not living in teepees. You've also got the mound builders. The mound builders are found in Georgia, and in the southeast. So this picture is actually one that I took at Okmulgee National Monument. So we used to call it the Indian Mounds. It's probably not politically correct anymore, but some people still call it that. And so what these mound builders, the Eastern Woodland natives would do is they would build up these mounds for various reasons. Now, they didn't all live in these. That's a common misconception. They had structures that were usually made of wood or branches, stuff like that. Um, but they use these for ceremonial purposes. There are also burial mounds where people were obviously buried in them. So there are some that you could go into, some where people were buried. There were some that were used, they were really high up, kind of like those pyramid temples that you see, like with the Mayans, but it's made of dirt. And it's really kind of high up, and you would have ceremonies like the green corn ceremony at those mounds. I also wanted to show you these guys. These guys are called long-nosed god maskettes. So we're not entirely sure what they're used for, because like I said, these native groups don't leave any written records behind, and that's generally what historians use. So since they don't leave any written record, we can only guess. Now we're going to use a couple of different means of guessing. We're not just going to guess blindly. We use to study Native American history, we use something called ethnohistory. Ethnohistory is a combination of history, archaeology, and anthropology. And so we're going to use side streaming and upstreaming to decide what these guys are actually used for. So side streaming is when you take things that were done at the same time by different groups and you apply that to the group that you're studying. Upstreaming is when you take things that were used later on by the same group that you know for sure happened, like you have the Spanish or the French leaving accounts. Um, and you apply it to something in the past. And so that's kind of what we do with the long-nosed god maskettes. There are similar sort of maskettes later on. So we use upstreaming to determine that these were probably used in adoption rituals. Something that was very common amongst Native American groups was, especially amongst the mound builders, their societies were kind of fragile. People would leave, the societies would break up a lot. And so you would have people being adopted into new societies, and we think that they use these for the ritual to do that. All right, so this video is the Cherokee creation myth. Now, the video is hilarious, I think. It was made by high schoolers. There are probably better quality videos out there. But I love this video because it directly uses the Cherokee creation myth, um, and it it's funny. I think it's funny. Um, so you guys are going to watch this, and you're actually going to use that for one of your written prompts. So while you're watching it, I want you to think about what this myth tells you about the Cherokee and using side streaming, kind of applying it to other groups, what it tells you about Native America in general.
Grandfather, how did we get here?
Well, let me tell you the story of our people, the Cherokee. The Earth is a great island floating in a sea of water, and suspended at each of the four main compass points by a cord hanging down from the sky vault, which is of solid rock. The Earth's creation began when Little Water Beetle, tired of being crowded in the sky with all the other animals, dove below the water to find a new place to live. Water Beetle came up with some soft mud which began to grow and spread on every side until it became the island which we call the Earth. As the mud was drying, the great buzzard flew about, and wherever his wings struck the earth, there was a valley, and where they turned up again, there was a mountain. And so the Cherokee country was full of mountains and valleys. Eventually other animals arrived, carried by the streams that flowed out of the mountains, and they commanded a sun across the sky each day. The animals were divided according to their needs and abilities, and plants and people were made. We do not know by whom. At first there were only a brother and sister, until he struck her with a fish and told her to multiply. And so it was. In 7 days a child was born to her, and thereafter every 7 days another, and they increased very fast until there was danger that the world could not keep them. Then it was made that a woman should have only one child in a year, and it has been so ever since. But all Cherokee know and fear that when the world grows old and worn out, the people will die, and the cords will break, and let the earth sink down into the ocean, and all will be water again.
You honestly expect me to believe that?
Yeah, actually. I mean, that was word for word what the legend said.
All right. So now I want to talk about exploration. So we've been talking about Native America. Well, Europeans started exploring in the late 1400s. I don't know if you guys remember this from high school. 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, so very late 1400s, and they find what they called the New World. Now, the New World was not actually a discovery, nor was it actually new. Obviously, Native Americans lived there, but the Vikings are also going to have a presence about 1,000 years or so before, not 1,000 years, I think it's like 500 years. Anyways, they're going to be there before the Europeans are going to come over. Now they do abandon their settlement. I think it's around, I think I thought 1,000 because it's 1,000 CE or so when Leif Erikson comes over. But so they know that land exists over here. The Europeans just kind of don't listen, which is kind of the story of world history, you guys. The Europeans, they just don't listen. Um, There are going to be several reasons, though, for exploration and later on for colonization. So let's talk about some of those reasons. So, the period where we start to explore and quote unquote discover the new world is a period also often referred to as the Renaissance. So before the Renaissance, there are the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages are kind of a period of forgetting. I know that doesn't really make sense. How could an entire group of people forget a bunch of stuff? But a lot of that is going to have to do with the power of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is going to take a lot of control over Western Europe. Um, and as they do, they're going to start to keep people from learning Latin, which is the language that the Bible is in. They're going to kind of hoard information, wealth, and ideas. And so the Dark Ages are a really rough period in world history for everyday Europeans. The Renaissance is kind of the reaction to that. It's a rebirth of education and worldviews related to ancient Greco-Roman learning. So Latin and all of the stuff from ancient Greece and ancient Rome, those ideas are going to start to come into play again. People are going to start studying all of that again. And it's going to be characterized by a lot of inventions like the printing press. When the printing press is invented, people start to learn to read because they can get their hands on things to read. And they start to be printed in the vernacular. The vernacular means that it's the language that people actually speak. So instead of Bibles only being written by hand in Latin, now you're going to start to see them being written in English or German or whatever language the people are speaking. This is also an age of exploration. The age of exploration is a period of discovery, and it's begun by the desire to find new, more efficient trade routes. So the age of exploration is happening during the Renaissance. So is the Protestant Reformation that we're going to talk about in just a second. And this is also the age of the new monarch. So all of these things are kind of intertwined. So the age of exploration is this period where we start trying to find easier, better ways to get to places like China, so that we can trade with them. Ultimately, I have this idea that people are basically dragons. We like shiny things. We like to hoard things like gold. We also like stuff that's really far away and hard to get. Those are the things that are worth the most money to us. Those are the things that we just really, really want. And so during the age of exploration, it's really expensive before that to get things like spices or silks. And so people want to get their hands on them. But there are a couple of ways before the age of exploration to get stuff. First is going by land. You have a couple of options with that. You can go through Russia. Um, Spoiler for all of world history, it's a really bad idea to go through Russia in the winter. Napoleon is going to learn that later on, and then Hitler later than him. If you go to Russia in the winter and you're not Russian, it's going to end badly. So we don't really want to go through Russia. Our other option is to go through what we now refer to as the Middle East. And this area is one, very deserty, so it's very hot, it's hard to travel through, but also it's dominated by Muslims and Christians, and most Europeans at this point are Christians. Christians and Muslims have a long-standing history of hating each other for not believing in God correctly. That's kind of the long and short of it. We're not going to go into too much detail about it, but there have been wars all throughout world history. The Crusades are a really good example of Muslims and Christians fighting with each other. So the Muslims don't really want them going through their land, but if they are, they're going to make a killing at it. And so they charge them for safe passage through their land to get to the places that they want to go, like China. And it's kind of like really expensive shipping. I don't know if you guys have ever gone to order something and realized that you're paying $5 for shipping, so you ordered like $20 more worth of stuff so you didn't have to pay the shipping. I do that. I have a tendency of doing that. I'll need something that's like $5, but $50 shipping is free, so I just buy like $45 worth of stuff. That way I don't feel like I'm getting cheated. So that's kind of how people feel during this period. They don't want to pay all of that money, that extra money to get to what they want to buy. And so they start looking for alternate routes. They start trying to sail places. And so, because of that, you're going to see inventions, we're going to see improvements in ships. And we're also going to see people like Columbus start sailing to different places and exploring a little bit. This is also a period of the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation is begun by a guy named Martin Luther. Now, just to clarify, Martin Luther and Martin Luther King Jr., not the same guy. You wouldn't think I'd have to say it, but I do. So, Martin Luther is a Catholic, and he wants to reform the Catholic Church because he thinks that the Catholic Church is being a little bit shady. There are a lot of practices amongst the Catholic Church, the higher ups at this point in time, that are pretty shady. Like I said, during the Dark Ages, they're hoarding a lot of wealth and information because information is power, you guys. They're doing things like one of their big practices was the selling of indulgences. So, if you are Catholic, one of the things that is required in Catholicism is you have to confess your sins. So, you usually do this to your priest, um, and you have to get forgiveness. There are things that you have to do to get that forgiveness, like say Hail Marys and stuff like that. Well, indulgences are basically mm, more or less get out of hell free cards. They forgive your sins without you having to go and confess them to a priest. And you can buy these indulgences. Well, you guys can see the problem with that, right? If you're selling forgiveness for sins, the people who can buy that forgiveness are the people who have the most money. And so, if you know that you can buy forgiveness, you're a lot more likely to do bad things, right? And so, this is a really, really shady practice that Martin Luther wants to end. Well, so what he does is he goes and he posts his 95 Theses on the church door. It's 95 ideas of how he wants to reform the Catholic Church. Religion in general has a tendency to not want to change. I'm talking Christianity, Islam, Judaism. Religions don't like changing. They're very kind of finite. They don't like changing with the times. Um, and so the Catholic Church really doesn't want to change what they're doing. And so what you see instead is a schism. It's basically the Catholic Church breaks up with itself, and now you have the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church. So if you are a Christian, and you are not an Orthodox Greek or a Roman Catholic, you are most likely a Protestant, whether you realize it or not. And so this group kind of divides itself from the Catholics, and as a result, the Catholic Church is going to lose a lot of power. And that's where you get the idea of the new monarchs. As the power of the Catholic Church kind of goes away, kings and queens start to centralize and consolidate their own power. Kings and queens always kind of answered to the Pope before this. You also don't see the exact boundaries and power relationships between like France and Britain and Spain that you're going to see later on. This is where that kind of starts to coalesce. So during this Renaissance period, like I said, we're going to get the quote unquote discovery of the New World. So Christopher Columbus is going to sail westward, and what he's doing is actually searching for an easier way to the east. He believes that if he sails westward, he will actually just go all the way around the earth and end up in some place like China or India. Now, a common misconception, and something that I was taught when I was little, and something that a lot of my students have told me, even recently, that they were taught when they were younger, is the idea that Christopher Columbus was the only guy that knew that the Earth was round, and everybody didn't want to give him money for his voyage because they thought that he would sail westward and he would just fall off the Earth. That is fundamentally untrue. Most people, most scientists, most educated people at this point in time in the 1490s knew that the Earth was round. But scientists had actually calculated how big they thought the Earth was, and their calculations and Columbus's calculations were very different. Columbus thought the Earth was a lot smaller than it actually is. And one of the reasons that people didn't want to give Columbus money to go westward is because they thought that he would die before he ever got to his destination. If he hadn't had the good fortune of running into North and South America, he would have, because the Earth was a lot bigger than he thought it was. Um, he eventually is able to get funding from Spain, from Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand. They were actually a fairly new set of monarchs. Spain had only kind of consolidated its power. Really within that year, a lot had been happening, and they had a pretty big rivalry with Portugal, which is actually where Christopher Columbus is from. And so Columbus, and this is a pretty smart idea, he kind of pitted Portugal and Spain against each other. He told the Spanish monarchs that Portugal was offering him money, and so they ended up funding him. So when he sets sail, he's actually going to end up on Hispaniola. Hispaniola is the Bahamas today. When he gets there, he encounters the Arawak Indians. I want you guys to remember that because we celebrate Columbus Day, and the idea of the discovery of the Americas, and most people don't even know who Columbus ran into. They're just like, I don't know, they're Indians. They were the Arawak. Um, the Arawak were a very peaceful group of Native Americans. And as such, Columbus kind of thought that they were stupid. And you guys are going to read some sources. You're going to read something by Columbus, something written by a guy named Bartolomé de las Casas, and you're going to read another source from um, a conquistador, a Spanish conqueror. And so you're going to see these three different perspectives of the initial contact with Native Americans in the New World. Historians use primary sources in order to determine what actually happened in the past. So one of our jobs is to look for bias and to try to see why people are writing or saying the things that they did about an event. So you're going to look at all of these and you're going to kind of look at why Columbus might be saying what he is, why he might be inclined to tell the truth or not tell the truth, why he might be giving part of the story, things like that. So Columbus, though, when he gets to the New World, one of the big things that he's going to do is he's going to set up a system that made every Indian over 14 responsible for a certain amount of gold every month. Now, one of the problems with that is there's actually not that much gold in South America. And when these quotas weren't reached, he would do things like cut off the hands of people who didn't meet their quotas. And I'm not talking he would cut off their hands entirely. A lot of the time, he would sever just the tendons and leave the hand dangling. It reminds me a little bit of, you're going to hear a lot of Harry Potter references. So, like, if you don't like Harry Potter, I'm really sorry. But it reminds me a little bit of Nearly Headless Nick. The hand is gonna almost come off, but not quite, and it's supposed to serve as a reminder of what happens when you mess with the Spanish. The Spanish are going to come over and they're going to be all about conquering. Um, they're also not exactly going to be super nice. So we have this quote in a letter from Columbus. So Columbus wrote this. He says, "100 Castellanos." Um, are as easily obtained for a woman as for a farm. So this is money, you guys. And it is very general, and there are plenty of dealers who go about looking for girls. Those from 9 to 10 are now in demand. All right, so that's pretty gross. But that's one of the things that our good friend Christopher Columbus was doing when he came to the Americas. The Spanish in general were, like I said, very big on conquering. They had the idea of the three G's, gold, God, and glory. So they colonized with the intent of conquering and converting people to Catholicism. So the people that came over were conquistadors. These are Spanish conquerors. Conquistadors, they actually they actually got their jobs during something called the Reconquista in Spain. It's a series of campaigns by Christian states to recapture land that was occupied by Muslims. Essentially, the Reconquista is the Spanish kicking Muslims out. It's something that happens around the time of the Spanish Inquisition, if you've ever heard of that. So once these conquistadors come over and they start taking land, one of the big things that they're going to do is they're actually going to take over entire Native American groups. So they're going to start something called the encomienda system. It's a form of plantation slavery. It works Indian slaves essentially to death on large privately owned estates. So what's going to happen is you have the conquistadors come over, they take over a large group of Native Americans, they take over maybe their entire tribe, their entire village, and they make them work for them. Now these guys are going to be slaves, but they're not slaves as we think of it. They're not the same thing as African chattel slavery, which we will talk about in a later lecture. These guys are slaves bound to land rather than bound to a master. So they have to work for these guys. Later on, they're going to be used in gold and silver mines. A couple of the biggest conquistadors that we're going to see are Hernan Cortez and Francisco Pizarro. Cortez is going to topple the Aztec Empire. Pizarro topples the Incans. And all of this is going to lead to something super, super important called the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange is this huge interchange of plants, animals, people, ideas, diseases, all sorts of stuff between the old and new worlds. But the biggest thing that you're going to see is the interchange of disease. That's going to be something that is going to absolutely decimate the Native American population. Now, finally, I want to talk a little bit about the French because the Spanish come over first. The French are going to start to trickle in afterwards, and the British are going to colonize kind of way later on. And we're going to talk about them in the next lecture. So, the French are going to try to settle first in Florida. They're also going to try fishing in the Atlantic, but ultimately they are going to see that fur trading makes them the most profit. The thing about fur trading, though, is they don't want to go and hunt things. They want to trade with Native Americans to get fur. So they're going to trade fairly cheap things, pots and pans, guns, things like that. They're going to trade those for fur because fur was all the rage in Europe, especially beaver hats. I don't know what it was about beaver hats. I guess beavers, their pelts are water resistant. It rains a lot in Europe, so I mean maybe that's why they liked beaver hats. It was like an umbrella. I don't really know. But so they find out this is really, really profitable. And so what that's going to mean though is you don't need a whole bunch of people coming over here for the fur trade. The more people you have over here, the less money people are going to make. So it's not super lucrative. You're not coming and taking over entire native groups like the Spanish are going to. So you'll have fairly few settlers. Now there are going to be some major colonies, especially in places like Quebec. But they're very few and far between where you have major French colonies. For the most part, you're going to have few settlers, and they're going to need to have a good relationship with Native Americans. And this creates a concept called the middle ground. The middle ground is both a symbolic sort of area and a physical area where the French and Native Americans work together. They find a middle ground or a common ground, which is that fur trade, and it keeps them from fighting in the same way that you're going to see the Spanish fight with Native Americans, and in the same way that you're going to see the British fight with Native Americans. Now, that doesn't mean that the French were always super nice to natives. Um, but they do have a tendency to intermarry more. They have a tendency to live a little bit more like Native Americans, and that's going to be pretty important later on. But that is all that I have for you guys for this lecture, so I will see you guys next time.